Welcome, everyone. I'm here with Jo-Ann Mort, whose book, Precise Chaos, is coming out May 4th from Aerosmith Press. The collection travels through space and time as Jo-Ann reflects on womanhood and relationships, religion, as well as war and revolution through her experiences as a political organizer and a peace activist in the Middle East. She studied poetry at Sarah Lawrence College and at NYU, and after a 22-year hiatus, she returned a few years ago to poetry and hasn't been able to stop since. Her poems recently appeared in Plume Poetry, The Woman's Review of Books, and Atlantic Review, among other places. As a journalist and analyst, she writes about the domestic lives of both Israelis and Palestinians, as well as Polish politics and global democracy issues. She is a member of Writers for Democratic Action, a member on the editorial board of Dissent magazine, and has recently published her work in Democracy Journal, Index on Censorship, The American Prospect, and the New York Review of Books Daily. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Jo-Ann.
Thank
Um,
you, Laura.
yeah, I wanted to invite you to start with reading a poem of your choice.
Sure. I'm going to read a poem called In Lviv. As you mentioned, my poems do traverse the world, and I have several poems in here about Poland, but this poem was written when I traveled from Poland to Lviv. I just want to say about it, this was written before the current war. But it reflects on an ongoing situation that's been going on for over a decade, which was the Russian control over the area near the Crimea. And that was already starting to really bubble up when I was there just before the war. It was about 5 years ago that I was there. So it shows the readers how far back this has been, and way before that also. In Lviv, in Market Square, Putin's face is on toilet paper and floor mats for sale among the coffee and tomatoes. In the park at dusk, I sit on a bench, pretending it's Lemberg before the war. My full skirt scrapes the immaculate ground. At the end of the road, the National Gallery gleams with a banner hailing the Ukrainian prisoners of conscience locked up by Russia. Stuck in the pages of Joseph Roth or Shalom Aleichem, reversing in time to find something to hold in the present. I am alone on a vast continent. A tour guide takes me through streets where so many Jews once lived. In a pocket park, a stone is inscribed to the domed synagogue, burned to the ground as congregants held back by the Nazis tried to run into the flames to save the Torah scrolls. Back at the Leopolis Hotel, I sit at the bar on a night too drenched with rain to go outside. The bartender, pale with red lipstick, speaks perfect English that she learned in hipster Williamsburg. She wants to return to Brooklyn or just America. At the table next to me, a man from Copenhagen, newly divorced, anxiously grips a guidebook. Unburdened by history, he is relieved to be anywhere but Denmark.
Thank you. Beautiful reading.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, so I will be asking questions about other poems, but I wanted to begin more broadly, and ask how your first book of poetry came into being.
Well, as you mentioned, I had had this 22-year hiatus in my writing for lots of intense reasons. And when I started to write again, I was really lucky enough to get into some terrific publications and started to recreate a community of writers, which, is something you have to do when you fall off the cliff
Hmm.
of poetry. You lose your community also. And actually, with this book, what happened was I did have a very close friend of mine still from college who's a novelist and teaches writing at Sarah Lawrence, Brian Morton, who was friends with Askold Melnichuk, who is, of course, the publisher of Aerosmith, who is also a friend of mine. But I did not send my manuscript to Askold. Brian did, without my knowing. And And Askell then got in touch with me and said, "Hey, Jo-Ann, these are pretty interesting poems if you want to talk." So I just feel like I was so lucky to find the appropriate home for this, not only in such a revered press and with such extraordinary company around me who are also being published, but also a brilliant editor's eye from Askell, and a real supporter. So I really, I feel like sometimes places do find the right place, whether it's how you live your life or the piece of artwork that you do. And I found the right home for my book.
I'm glad. Yeah, we're very happy to publish it. And I love this piece of art. Kandinsky,
That's
I think.
Kandinsky. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I did a lot of searching. I found the artwork and I did a lot of searching to find
Hmm.
right the right piece. And I just love it. Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned connections, and I guess I wanted to go back a little bit to when you first started, early into making those connections. And as an undergrad or undergraduate, you did move away from it, kind of more in the direction of journalism, which I really respect. But what was the original lure, and then what lured you away from it before you?
Okay, so I started to write poetry when I was a little kid. I mean, I remember 10 years old, both writing and reading poetry. I read vociferously as a kid, all sorts of fiction and poetry, and was very interested in news also. And I got published even at a very young age. When I was 16, I had a poem published in a magazine it was actually a college level publication published by Jewish students in the Philadelphia area. And I had sent some poems in. And I was editing my high school literary magazine, and then I went to an arts camp where I studied drama and writing, was published in that magazine. And so I was poetry was very much a part of who I was. And I went specifically to Sarah Lawrence because of the extraordinary writing program they had. And, one of the things I looked around for after I started to write again and when I started to think about publication of a book was for my previous teachers, which is, again, a normal thing you look for if you're looking for a community. And they're all dead because I had,
Oh.
and they were quite incredible people. I studied with Galway Cannell and Jerry Stern and Tom Lux and Jane Cooper. And then I took a semester in graduate school at NYU and I studied with Yehuda Amichai and Joseph Brodsky. So I really had incredible training, but, and a community back then, but, you have to recreate it. So, um, I found when I was younger, and I did after I graduated from college, I worked in publishing, and I did have a sort of community, the creation of a community of writers in New York, but I got very involved in politics, in
Mhm.
progressive left-wing politics, which I'd always had been, but I got deeply engaged with that, and I started to think about how I wanted to live my life. And one of the reasons I left graduate school was I thought, do I really need a master's program, a master's degree? Am I going to teach? My advice to those who are thinking of it is don't drop out of the programs. I dropped out of another program at NYU also in philosophy. Get your degrees, your advanced degrees. You never know. But at the time, I think I did make the right decision in thinking I wasn't going to need an MFA to teach because I didn't see myself as living that life. So I had to sort of think about, well, what life am I going to live? And I fell into doing communications as a profession in nonprofits, in publishing, and then in politics. And I started to earn a decent living. So I sort of started through that trajectory. And then I really always loved journalism and always also thought about it. My dream was to be a foreign reporter. So I created this life for myself where I was able to take a month off of work in the summer and go overseas to Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territories and get tons of assignments for journalism. At the time, there was still print reporting. I'm old enough. I would have to call in my article or send it by fax. We didn't have computers then to do it, and go over. I had those little reporter notebooks and go over the changes on the phone with the editor. I was stringing for the Chicago Tribune and a bunch of places. Um, and I think what drew me to the journalism was not just the interest of telling people's stories and be able to be part of change on the ground, but also it was a way to do writing and not be alone. And that's another very important piece of creating art, and especially poetry. You have to be alone, and you have to enjoy being alone. You have to, if not enjoy it, accept it. And I was in my 20s and 30s and even 40s, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't be alone. I couldn't sit by myself and give myself time to write and to read. And so the poetry suffered. And I felt also a sort of desperation that journalism can help change the world, poetry can't. So it was sort of all of those things together that I wasn't even all that conscious of, except that I was very conscious of no longer writing poetry. And it made me sad. And it did make me question my identity because it was so much a part of who I was. But I felt like I had enough other things to shield me. Um, what got me back to the poetry was, and I say one other thing about the journalism. I do think, I'm not trained as a journalist. I never went to journalism school. I wasn't trained as a communications person either. I just did all of this by instinct. And I think with the journalism, what really helped me, I do a lot of opinion writing, so that's obviously, I can put my own ideas in there. But in terms of the reporting and the journalism, and I do a lot of interviews with people, I feel like my poetry training, my workshop training really helped me tell stories. And also, I was, for a while, I was writing a column for a US newspaper, a Jewish paper called The Forward. And, I had to write, again, in those days, you really had to write to strict word count because they were printed copies. So I had to write to 800 words, and I had to learn how to do that. And training in poetry really helped me learn to tell a story in a concise way, or to describe a person with that one little thread of something that gives you insight into who that person is. That I learned all that from poetry. So I felt like even if I hadn't ever gone back to poetry, the poetry training was helpful. But when I turned 59, um, I started to write poems again. The reason I did that is my father died when he was 60, and his birthday is a day after mine. And when I turned 59, or sorry, when I turned 60, I thought to myself, wow, I'm a day older than my father. I'm 60. My father died when he was 59. And I thought, well, that's very poetic. I mean, obviously, I wasn't a day older than my father, but I just thought that's so poetic. I have to write a poem about that. And that I sat down and wrote a poem. It's not a good poem. It's not in the book, but it got me started again in poetry. The other thing that happened around that time was it was the first Trump administration.
Mm.
And I felt, as so many of us did, and now again, I felt that everything I believed in was just falling apart. And I needed something really ephemeral that couldn't be impacted by the horrors. And for me, that was literature and art of all kinds. But literature, I thought, very same poetry where I felt like poetry can't really make anything happen. I went back to it and I was like, wow, it really can. Poetry really can connect the dots and explain things and show people different sides of a story and show people different realities that they don't know about. And I just became so embedded in reading again, reading both good literature and of all kinds and poetry. I never looked back. And here we are, second Trump administration, where I need poetry more than ever. And we all do, I think.
I think you're doing exactly the right thing. Even kind of move. Your work is very timely, and even though some of it was written sort of not in this exact time, kind of as you mentioned with the war in Ukraine. But we need good poetry. We need political poetry and journalism. And so yeah, I'm glad you're back.
Thank you.
Um,
So am I.
yeah. Um, you mentioned um after your father passed, which I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
Um, the kind of poetic nature of being older than him in that time and still now. But what's the earliest poem in this book? That might have been the one you wrote.
Actually, yeah, I think the earliest poem in this book may be the title poem, which is no longer called A Precise Chaos. It's now called um, Dressing for My Father's Funeral. Uh,
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
so it was the original title of that poem was A Precise Chaos: Dressing for My Father's Funeral.
Mm.
And when my father died, I was in my late 20s. So I wrote this poem right after he died. So I think that is probably the oldest poem in the book.
Yeah, I remember when I read this one in particular, it did strike me, and not that it was different from the others, but it's a lot of pain, and I don't know, maybe it's a tiny bit triumphant of getting back and having it in here. Look, there's my work.
Yeah.
And similarly, what's the most recent poem in this collection?
Most recent poem is toward the back of the book. It's Then and Now. I wrote that poem after I was in Paris last spring. I wrote it over the summer. So it was literally, I was finishing it when we were starting to put the manuscript together. Yeah. And I snuck it in. The first draft of the manuscript that Askold saw didn't have it in there. And when he sent me back notes, editor's notes, I sent him back like, okay, well, here's
Yeah.
another poem. I really wanted it in there. I felt like it sort of closed a story arc.
Hmm. Good. It works beautifully towards the end.
Thank you.
Um, yeah. And when did you know you had a finished manuscript?
That's an interesting question. This manuscript has gone through several iterations. It had several different titles. It had
Hmm.
different poems in it that are not in it now that probably will not be in any book. So I've been sending the manuscript out now for several years to, you send it out to small presses and contests um and I think when I heard when I sort of I guess I just kept honing it down until it got to a place where I felt like it was really a good finished product. And the poems, I don't miss any of the poems that are that are not in here. And I don't, as I said, I don't think some of those poems will ever be in any manuscript. I mean, I have, because I was writing so much when I was younger, I mean, I have a stack like this of notebooks of poems, and I've gone back now. I keep a folder of poems that are older poems that aren't that I thought were finished years ago, but are not.
Hmm.
Now I see they're not, and I'm working on them to bring them up to my present day brain. So it is a process all along, both the writing and the putting of a book together. And up until the very last minute, I was thinking, oh, just one more. I want to include one more. And but I decided that there were good sort of, as I said, story arcs in this book, and I should just leave it be. So this manuscript is only about a year and a half old, but I did have several previous manuscripts that I was sending around for several years. I was anxious to get out there. Once I started
Sure.
to write again, I'm 69 years old, and I'm very proud of saying my age because I do think that's part of the story of this.
Hmm.
But I also feel like I'm on the clock now. I've really got to produce and get stuff out there in the next several years. So I was anxious to get this out.
I'm happy to hear that you take advantage of older poems and see if you can, I think you said bring it up to kind of your current state of mind or where you are. And I don't know. I've tried to do that and haven't had a lot of luck. I feel like I'm in two different places, but maybe you have the firm educational background, the experience. Maybe it works out really well.
I
Um,
think, I think editing poems, I mean, there are poets who have talked about that they edit poems their whole life. And
I,
Auden famously kept poems that are some of his most famous poems actually out of his collected poems because he changed his politics. But uh but I find that it is to look at something. It's not necessarily that I've changed actually very little in my life in terms of my politics and my worldview, almost not
mm,
at all. I've stayed pretty steady, but words change. Words change
mm,
in the structure. I mean, the words don't change, obviously, they're physically on the page, but the way you see them changes, or a preposition changes, or something. When you have the advantage of time to go back and look at something, and read it again and hear it again, you realize that doesn't, why was I thinking? Like, why is that? preposition in there? Why is that? And especially line breaks, which I
Mm.
worked on. A lot of these poems in this manuscript changed, the line breaks changed things. And line breaks are so important in poetry. Um, and the rhythm. So, that stuff is really, I think, very important to go along with. And things that you thought were so immediate at some point 10 years ago, 20 years ago, are not so immediate anymore. And the other thing I just want to say about this that I think, again, publishing this book older in my life, I have a real advantage because these poems, almost all the poems are not just written about one particular time or place, but it's the reflection of, right? It sort of goes in a circle. It's where you were at a time, then you write the poem, then you look back at it, and then that also has an influence on where the poem ends up.
Mm.
So so it's very helpful to look at something that I thought was stayed in time, but in fact it's not. It's circular. And I think the poems reflect that.
Cool. Um, Sort of, well, relating to this, um, how do you revise your poems? And towards what are you revising? Um, you kind of mentioned thinking of sort of the nitty-gritty prepositions and not so much the broader meaning. What does that look like for you? And also, who are your first readers?
My first readers are the three people I dedicate the book to.
Mm,
Um, my old friend from college, she's a visual artist. Her name's Anita Glesta.
mm,
And then a friend of mine, two of my friends who I was at Sarah Lawrence with, Brian Morton, whom I mentioned is a
mhm,
novelist, and Jenny Doctorow, who is a dancer, but her father was a novelist. And I send the poems to them, and I send it in Google Drive and get comments back, Google Docs. I also, what I have started to do with the introduction of all of the technology that we have now, of course, I didn't do this when I was younger, but I record my poem
yeah.
and then I read it back to myself, or I listen back to myself to hear the rhythm in the poems. And that helps me. Also, when you're reading, if you're sort of stumbling through a word. So that's
Mhm,
very helpful. I also always let a poem sit at least overnight before I start making a lot of changes. And then what I do when I start a poem is what I do is I write it, I print it out. I write on the computer. I've tried to do long handwriting, but my handwriting is so bad, and I live on the computer, so it's just more comfortable for me to do that. So I write on the computer, I print out the poem, and then I sit with a hard copy, the page
mhm,
printed next to my computer, and I sort of keep looking at it, and I'll change a word here or there, and then I'll let it sit overnight, and then I'll come back to it. And every time I make a change, I print a new version out, even though it's a waste of paper and it might just be a comma that I've taken out. But I really like to see the way it looks clean on the sheet. I listen for the music in the words.
mhm,
I often repeat words without meaning to when I write. So I do that in my journalism too. It's one of my problems. So I look at where I've repeated words and whether it should be intentional, whether they should be repetitive there, or whether I should change it and take it out. So I do that. Um, I look for internal rhymes. I've noticed, even now reading some poems, I've noticed where there's internal rhyme that I didn't even know was there. So I think
mhm,
that's part of my writing process, but the internal rhymes are really important in poems, not intentional end line rhymes, but inside the poem. I think it's really what helps carry a poem. And I try to increase some of the internal rhymes if I can. And sometimes I'll let a poem sit for, 6 months and then come back to it. I found in putting this book together, Aerosmith had a copy editor work with me, and it was
mhm,
incredibly helpful. I'd never had my poems copy edited before. It's not something journalism, I work with copy editors all the time, but and with editors, but I'd never had a poem copy edited for like a comma or a period or a capital letter. It was a really interesting, useful process because, usually you put a period somewhere. You might not put a period at an end of a line in a poem
mhm.
for poetic reasons. But working with a copy editor and justifying why I did what I did in each line was really, really helpful. And we found changes that I made. And so that was a really interesting process.
Awesome. Um, Thank you for telling us about your process. I always
Yes,
feel lucky, get a little sneak peek. Um, so I'm gonna transition to one of your poems that I was particularly struck with and couldn't help but ask questions about.
sure.
Um, so can you please read for us the striking start to this collection
Yeah,
called The Men?
I will. I want to say before I read it,
Hmm.
um, to have this as this was not the first poem in the when I gave the manuscript to Askold, it was
Yeah.
Askold's idea to put
Okay.
it first. It sort of surprised me. I mean, that's again an interesting piece of the editorial process. It surprised me that he was struck by that poem. It's a very old poem. It's probably the second oldest poem in the book. Um, and I wrote it in my 30s. And I just, well, I'll read it and then I'll talk more about it. But I have been surprised at how it's sort of taken off. The men. The men were larger than life, starting revolutions in their heads and in their classrooms, negotiating contracts, whispering into the ears of governors and presidents. The men were larger than life. So life eluded them, the quiet time, the simple sip, the innocent glance, the hearth and home. And I, too, life eluded me. The men were larger than life. They were my life, my circle, my hearth, my home. And then the revolution failed. The workers lost their jobs to China, and we all grew older. The men were larger than life. They sparked a room when they walked in, if not a revolution. They were larger. They left wives and children and me. Life was larger than these men. They meant well. They desired great change. But life is larger than these men. And now life is where I am.
Yeah.
Um, so this poem grew out of very personal experiences, having to do with the kind of men that I was dating when
Tell
I
me
was a
about it.
young revolutionary. And they were people who were, as I say here, larger than life. They were prominent in whatever it was they were doing, whether they were academics or
Mhm.
activists or union leaders. Um, and and just because somebody is very good at leading a movement doesn't mean they're very good one-to-one on a personal level. In fact, often they're not. So that was a lot of what I was both reflecting in this poem, along with my own personal choices. Like maybe I'm making the wrong choices. You know, I'm choosing these larger than life men, and where's my life in all of this?
Mhm.
As I say, the quiet time, the hearth, the home. And it was a time um, that I was certainly living through that was, so this would have been in the late 70s through the 80s. There was a lot of activism, at least in the way that I was living my life. And I was just reflecting on all of that. I really felt like this was a poem that was sort of stuck in a 1960s mindset. So I guess I was
Mhm.
surprised when it got pulled out and put in the front of the book. But it's sort of good to know that it's having an impact on sort of where we are today. And I guess it's also very much about the kinds of decisions we all make on how to live our lives. And that's something we're all facing. We always face, but we're especially facing now as we're as we're deluged by all the horror out there. And how do we take action, and how do you combine a life of action with a personal life and all the interpersonal dynamics.
I'm happy this poem was first. I
Really?
see you, well, like I see what you mean about it. You said being stuck in sort of a 1960s mindset. I don't, it seems still so like nothing has changed. Some things have changed. Not much has changed. I like to write sort of a feminist through a feminist sort of lens, and I don't know, I felt if this was written in like you said you were in your 30s maybe
Yeah,
when you
it would have been written in the 80s. Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. I think it could have been your newest poem as far as I know. And
Yeah, so
the
interesting. Yeah.
the men
That's
are
great.
still larger.
It really makes me feel good that you can relate to it. You know, Gloria Steinem used to say that I've dated a Marxist and I think she said a fascist, and neither of them would take out the trash. That hasn't
I'm
changed.
sure.
I mean,
Hmm.
I hope it's changed for your generation. It hasn't changed for my generation.
A girl can dream, you know, shouldn't have to, but so you talked a little bit about the larger than life men. I think it's great because I can interpret it as my own sort of personal larger than life men or people we all look at, like, the president or something.
Right,
But
exactly. Or political heroes who may not
mm,
be, they may not be the best people
yeah.
in terms of what they do personally, but I mean, I think that is something we always struggle with, the difference between the ideals that we all aim for and how people interact with their own families or with their friends or in their personal lives. And you can stand for something that's good and represents humanity at its quote best, but doesn't mean that you know how to be a good father or parent or spouse
Hmm.
or partner.
Right. And whose job is it to teach you that? Maybe like your father who didn't
Right,
do that
right,
very well.
right. Yeah.
Um, so I'm thinking definitely of the speaker. And what role do you think these men might have played in the speaker's life and autonomy, or maybe women's autonomy more broadly?
Well, I'd say there are a few personalities in this book. There's one in particular that's threaded throughout the book who was a very strong personality, and he was certainly a part of writing this poem, an inspiration.
Hmm.
And he's no longer alive. And he was someone I was personally involved with romantically for a long time, and um, I think he'd be very surprised and thrilled that he's getting so much attention in this book.
Right.
But I think that's also something that comes with age because uh, he and I were involved. We never did get married for many reasons, but I always felt like there was something like he just couldn't handle the personal part of the relationship, and it made me very frustrated. But then when I started to put this book together and looked at all of the poems I'd written about him for decades,
Hmm.
including that last poem of the book is also about him then and now. And he's been dead now for years. So it was really a revelation for me about the importance not only of him in my life, but the poems were the ones that were telling me how important he was in my life because he's there in my brain. And there's another poem that you had suggested that I read, Market Day, is also about
Right.
him. And so he just keeps popping up. And I think that's um at the time, I just thought it was the interpersonal stuff that was so problematic that kept us from, many other things did too, but kept us from going to the next step. And now I'm thinking, well, maybe it was there and I didn't see it. So I think, sometimes it is hard to, in the moment, understand a relationship you're in, and that's something that art can help us with.
Hmm.
Reflect back on it. The person may be dead and you don't have a chance to resurrect the relationship, but art is a way. It's another way. There are psychiatrists that we can help with it. You can write in a journal, you can talk to your friends, but you can see a counselor. But art really can help synthesize your relationships in ways that surprise you. And that's so I see the poems as doing that and bringing me some surprises, which are really welcoming. I'm thrilled to have these surprises.
I'm grateful for that as a aspiring poet and as a reader. Um, well, I guess kind of trying to segue back to your writing or your style of writing. I was interested in the insertion of the speaker, and then the smallness of the space the speaker takes up with language, kind of. And I noticed it sort of right away. Where did it go? In the line, and I too, it, life, eluded
Mm,
me. So all the monosyllabic words there, in comparison to the larger than life men. And even
mhm.
though the poem kind of talks about time passing, we see the speaker's life mainly only in relation to the men, sort of
Mm.
until the end, and speaker isn't explicitly the focus of the poem. But for whom would you say is the audience of this poem?
Well,
And
those are,
who's it
first of all,
intended
that's a really great observation. Thank you for that. Because I didn't, now as you talk about it, it is so interesting, those tiny little I, it. I
for?
was using those words because of the rhythm. That's what, like,
Yeah.
it was, I felt like it was the it was sort of putting a stop to the
Mm.
grand, the grand
Mm.
experience of the poem. And it was like, wait, I'm here. It's I have to take a breath and put myself in there. So it's really interesting that you pulled that out. Um, I don't, when I write poems, I want the audience to be readers who will understand it. I don't have anything really in mind other than that.
Mm.
This was a very cathartic poem for me, honestly. It was I felt like I had reached a place in my life where I could say, oh, wait, I'm really making bad decisions here. Um, and I'm going to write a poem about it. So, I mean, I didn't really think about it much beyond that, although I did think there would be people. I didn't have any idea it would reach to a new generation. I'm really just so moved that you can appreciate this poem. But it was a big issue, certainly for women my age in that generation, of how we deal with equality in relationships. And I felt like, I could also be speaking to other people who would have a similar thing, but it was a very personal poem. I mean, I'm not going to
Mhm.
name names, but I know in my head exactly who I was writing about. It
Right.
was there were several guys and they really fit this mold, and it was just one after another. And I was like, wow, am I making bad choices here? I got to figure out what's going on with me. And out came this poem.
And for that, I'm grateful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's really, as I said, it's really great to know that it transfers to another generation, which is what good poems should do.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe Oswald sort of had that in mind. I'm not sure. I'm glad it spoke to him too as a man. Um,
I think I don't want to put words in Osgold's mouth, but I think, he and I work closely around this intersection through Writers for Democratic Action of poetry and politics and political action. And I think the sort of getting out there on this in the vanguard, and or getting out there to protest and try to change the world is the piece of it that spoke to him. That's what I
hmm,
think.
right.
He may say something different, but that would be my hunch.
I think you're right. Yeah, I'll have to ask him, but um I'd love to move on to Market Day now,
Okay.
which is about a deceased past partner. We discussed this person a little bit.
We discussed him a little bit, and yeah,
Yeah,
he shows up a lot in a lot of these poems. So,
right.
um,
And reflecting on him 30 years later in this
yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah. Market day. Python belt on my jeans. You bought it for me maybe 30 years ago at the market in Oaxaca, bargaining until the price was on the floor. It still fits me, wrapped around my stomach like a safety belt that holds memories close to my skin, a binding or a soft kiss each time I pull up my jeans. Dal, you called me, your Serbian accent getting thicker each year that you lived in America. Once you met me at the airport in Mexico City, handing me a canister of mace pepper spray to keep in my bag while we traveled. But instead of using it against a bandit or rapist, the cap got loose in the back pocket of my jeans while the yellow liquid seeped down my leg like the stripe on a wild animal. I can still feel the burn decades later. Our immediate need was to find me a new pair of jeans, so we shopped near the Zocalo, where the stores were full of denim, but only for tiny Mexican bodies, not my tall and angled bones. The pants we bought were too short and too wide, but the belt kept them firm around me. I returned once to Mexico without you. In the market in Cuernavaca, a vendor weighed strands of sterling to sell me, looped around my neck and chest, heavy and light silver, and the hoops, costing a peso or two, threaded through my ears. You are dead, your ashes scattered over the Adriatic. I remember the cut flowers in the glass jar in your bedroom on Brach, left for us by your daughter for our return from Dubrovnik. The putt-putt of your motorboat as it crawled around the island. We docked for fresh caught smelts and hard crust bread soaked in Dalmatian wine. On market day, we would walk down the steps of your street to the dock where the produce displayed was tomatoes and green onions. It was a simpler time, even though Tito was barely dead and a civil war was bubbling from the mountains and the fields. I was young then, or at least in my 20s, and thought I had all the time in the world. Tonight, the music near my house is live as I sit with friends you never met, eating roasted salmon and drinking wine snuck into the park in water bottles. The belt is beneath my t-shirt. I remember it only when my mind wanders from the stage and not really in boredom, but with a sort of reflex, wanting the air beside me to welcome you.
You for that reading.
Sure. This is, I want to say it's one of my favorite poems because I think
Hmm.
it does exactly what a poem should do. I still remember, I remember sitting, it was in a concert in the park across the street from me. And I remember literally sitting there, um, and and the belt, I still wear that belt. I wore it the other day, and it's a very long belt. And I remember the sort of strap sticking out from my t-shirt and looking at the belt and thinking of Mr. X, we'll call him,
Yeah.
because every time I wear the belt, I think of him. And then all these sort of things started to pop around in my brain, and I came home and I started to write the poem. And then the poem took me on a journey where it made all of these connections that I didn't expect. And that is what is so amazing about poetry, that, you start with an inspiration and it takes you to a place you didn't really know you were going, and it helps you find that place. And that's what this poem very much did.
Right. Yeah, as you said, it sort of flows from memory to moment and name and kind of in a prosaic sort of manner, or I thought of it a little bit like a letter to this person, maybe.
That's
Um,
nice. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very much a love letter, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Um, and we still have like the of course surprising sort of line breaks. Um, like this one, you bought it for me, maybe, line break, 30 years ago at the market. Um, and doll, you called me, yeah, doll, you called me your line break. Serbian accent getting thicker, line break. Each year
Yeah.
that you lived in America, that was pretty surprising to me too.
Yeah. 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 Those line breaks were all very intentional. I mean, you called me
Hmm.
your, could have been it not, I
Hmm.
mean, because the reference, the your, it's about him, this
Yeah.
next line is about his Serbian accent, but doll, you called me your lover, but whatever, that would be the sort of more expected thing. But this paragraph, or sorry, this stanza was
Hmm.
really started, but it was really about him, like trying to place him. And the I also felt like with this poem, it's a pretty long poem, and I wanted the line breaks to really carry the writer through.
Hmm.
It's a poem that goes through several decades, um,
Hmm.
and I wanted to give that sense also in the stanzas. Um, and and I also feel like it starts and stops with the same, the opening stanza and the closing stanza are both the belt on my jeans in the
Hmm.
same physical place. I'm sitting there you don't know that I'm there, but python belt on my jeans, I start immediately talking about the belt. I don't say where I am at the
Right.
concert. Um, and that's where I end in the last stanza tonight. The music from my house is live, and I'm sitting there wearing the belt. But so I feel like the role of the lines is to sort of carry the reader through this story of decades and end up sort of where it started. Again, about the inspiration.
Mhm.
People who know
Mhm.
who this is about, as
Yeah.
soon as I read it, they know exactly who it is. I have to say the way the doll you called me in a Serbian accent getting thicker, that's very much a trademark of who this person was. They could
Hmm.
hear him saying it, and even the putt putt of your motorboat he used. I would never normally. I thought it was great for a poem. Putt putt really is what a little motorboat can do, but he
Right.
would use that all the time. I'm putt putting around. I'm like, what? You're what? So I that's where I got that was from him. And so there's a lot of him in this poem. And um, um, so it was very much, I think, as I said, I mean, he never saw this poem. I'm not sure if I wrote it when he was still, he might have still been alive when I wrote it. I honestly can't remember. It's an old poem that's been
Mm.
revised. Um, but it is very much a poem to both his memory and his honor, and an acknowledgement of, okay, well, we broke up a million times. We didn't do this, we didn't do that, but boy, you're still with me, man. You're with me every
Right.
time, So, and I think a lot of people have people like that in their lives who
Mhm.
who may have only existed in their life, whether it was as a lover or as a best friend or as even a family member, but they just keep coming back. And you don't realize the importance of who they are in your life until you see it in retrospect. And that's a lot of what this poem's about, too.
Hmm. You answered this question a little bit, but I was curious why kind of the only dialogue Mr. X has in this poem is doll. And well, you talked about putt putt, but I don't know, you said that kind of encapsulated him, but why doll? I don't know.
Because that's what he used to call me, and it was sort of droll when he would say that. I mean, it
Mm.
was very much affection, but it was also it could be sarcastic, and
Sure.
when I think of him saying that word with his heavy accent, which did
Mm.
get, I mean, it was the joke about him. He came to the United States when he was 16, but his accent seemed to get heavier and heavier instead of
Yeah.
softer and softer. And I mean, it's partly because he went back to the former
Mm.
Yugoslavia frequently. That's actually where he died, and
Mm.
Croatia, and he traveled and spoke many languages. And so he never really perfected an English accent, an American accent. And so that word just for me just sort of says it all about his affection for me. And
Mm.
as I said, when I say it, anyone who knew him goes, "Oh my God, we know who this is."
Right.
It was his insignia, his significant, signatory
Yeah.
word. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's almost like he was resistant to have an American accent. He wanted to hold on to who he
Oh,
was.
definitely. Oh, absolutely. He was very proud of not being an American. I mean, he had an American citizenship, but
Hmm.
he went through the process. But he was a very ideological leftist, and
Yeah.
was very, very proud of his, especially of his what was former Yugoslavian. I mean, he was very. I have
Mhm.
some a lot, several poems in here about the breakup of Yugoslavia, and he was heartbroken by that and fought very
Mm.
hard around democracy issues there. But and then you had to choose, if you were a Yugoslav citizen, you had to choose after the country broke up, if you felt a loyalty to two places. I mean, it was, he was a Serb, but he was living in Croatia. So he
Mm.
actually chose Croatian citizenship as a minority. Um, and there was a lot of attacks on him because of him being a minority within Croatia. So that was also a big choice. I mean, we're seeing it now in a very ugly way in America, where Trump is pushing an American triumphalist nationalism on the world. But in several decades ago, as the Soviet Union collapsed, this was something that, many people in Europe were dealing with, especially Eastern and Central Europe, of how they become citizens and create democracy and what it means. And so for him, it was a very important thing, and his speaking and his language and his accent was all part of it.
Right.
which for me, I will say was fascinating. And again, one of the reasons so many of these poems take place around the world is at a very young age. I was in my 20s and early 30s when I would travel around the world with him. And I got to meet political leaders and intellectuals in high places. And it really put me in a mindset of, oh, this is my world. Like, this is the world that I write about. We are interconnected, and that I'm not just here in as an American, but I'm an American that's seen the world and has an impact on the world, and the world has an impact on me. And I think these poems reflect that.
Speaking of which, I also kind of wanted to ask about the theme of travel in your poems. What makes writing about travel important to you? And also, when you're writing, do you tend to do it at home or when you're away? Do you need that space when you come back? Yeah.
Um, I do it in both places. I do it
Mhm.
away and at home. I find travel, I love travel. I think if there's anything that I love more than anything else in the world, I love to travel. And
Mhm.
I have, I created a bucket list during COVID of play. I felt really not just that we were stuck in our apartments or homes, but that I couldn't get to an airport and go somewhere for me
Mhm.
was really an issue. I did actually manage to get to Israel during COVID. I got an exemption at the time. There was a different
Mhm.
government in power there. It was a progressive friend of mine who happened at the time to be in the government and got me a special pass to be able to get into the country. So I was able to go there. But it For me, travel is, again, it's about the interconnectedness in the world. It's also about learning about ourselves through other people.
Mhm.
And it is what gives me inspiration for my poems. And I usually, when I don't travel like most people, I have done, and I have with this person who's pops up throughout the book. I've gone with him to the beaches and, Mexico or whatever, but I don't normally just go to a beach. When I travel, I go to do interviews. I figure out
Mhm.
somebody I want to meet and I do a journalistic interview. And then I figure out what the inspiration will be for poems or who I can meet, and I figure out who knows who, and I look on all, my LinkedIn and my Facebook page, and I find friends that I can meet, and I really want to learn the life when I'm there. And so there are a few cities that I feel like I sort of know, and even cities like London and Paris, where I don't really, when I go there, I was just in London and I didn't leave central London, and I've been to London many times, and I know that neighborhood very well around the university and the great bookstores that are there. And there's so many parts of London I've never even been to, but I feel like I want to dig into a certain neighborhood and feel part of it. And the same with Paris. There's sort of
Mhm.
one arrondissement, around the Luxembourg Gardens where I feel like I need to know this neighborhood and feel like how the people are who live there. And that helps ground me, and then write about the experience, or it's sort of like a spirit that comes up through me and I can start writing. So travel is a huge inspiration for me. And I do need, when I write, I find increasingly as I get older, I've been writing, I keep a note, I keep a journal, and I also keep my phone, of course, and I've started to put notes in my phone. And I find increasingly that what sets me off to a poem is one word. Like I'll hear a word that's a sort of curious word to me, or what does it mean? And like this, I have never written a poem about the word doppelganger, but for some reason, and I don't think I ever could, but for some reason that word just popped into my head, doppelganger. That's sort of an interesting word. So, I think about a word and I write the word down, and then I think about what goes around that. Or I have several poems about Poland in this
Mhm.
book and the Polish Jewish experience. And the first time, my family, of course, is, as many Ashkenazi Jews are. My family is from Parts of my family are from parts of Poland. And I also the first time I went to Poland, I went to Auschwitz, which is an experience I never ever have been able to get out of my brain. And I have a poem about that in here too. So it was hard to not write poetry about Poland. I walked around in Warsaw feeling, as I say in one of the poems, literally like I was walking on um on people's bones. Like it's just you feel that weight. And so, I just take notes. I sit with the experience. I sit with a glass of wine. I do love I like finding a cafe and sitting. Actually, when I remember I went to Schindler's, the museum that was based on Schindler's factory where he saved so many Jews. And there is, I mean, it sounds sort of sacrilegious, but next to the museum, which is quite well done, there's a wine bar. And I just remember like, wow, the wine bar. Sat there at the wine bar with my notebook and, took notes and with a glass of wine. And so I find that really a relaxing way. Less coffee. Coffee, like, I
Right.
drink a lot of coffee, but coffee just stirs me up. Sitting with a glass of wine. I think like some people writers used to always feel like they needed a cigarette to write. I don't smoke and I'm not certainly going to do that. But even if I don't drink the wine, like sitting with the glass of wine just makes me feel like I can chill and figure out
Right.
writing. So, but I mostly write here at home. I have a very big table in my living room that looks out over the park, and I throw a lot of books on it, and they sit here for months, and my notebooks and my computer, and that's mostly where I end up writing.
Um, I'd love to talk about on what third poem. If you're ready to
Sure,
transition.
sure.
Yeah. Um, but it's called Not in This Lifetime, in which the speaker describes the two daughters she will have. Um, yeah, and I'd love to hear you read it, and
Okay.
more questions will follow.
Yes. Not in this lifetime. My daughters will be named Bella and Justice. Their curly hair will be blondish brown, with ringlets gracing their shoulders, just like mine before I dyed it red. When I am old, they will sing to me, quietly, breathlessly, above sound, above light. And when my eyes go, they will read to me, but mostly they will do everything that I forgot to do or simply didn't get around to. They will change the world, or at least a tiny slice of it. Wearing black on black like their mom, they will shout, they will sing, they will appear, just not in this lifetime or to me.
Thank you for that ending.
Yeah. This is obviously a very autobiographical poem. Um, it was, it came from a very strange inspiration. I thought of the two names of the girls, and I literally was like, I think probably awake one night, not able to sleep. And I thought, well, if I ever had children, I would have named them Bella and Justice. And I then, of course, started to think through all of this. Um, and um, it's a poem, I think, that is not just for people or women who, for whatever reason, haven't been able to have kids or had kids, um, but also it is about it's sort of a complement to the first poem in the book, the men, about how we have to continue the fight generation to generation, that nothing is going to end, and that I've always felt part of the legacy that I'm going to pass to a next generation, whether they're my children or not, is I'm not going to be able to finish it. And God knows we're going to leave a much worse world, it looks like, at this moment than we all started with. But that you have to transfer not just your personal feelings or your family heirlooms, but your values to the next generation. And I think that I would hope that poem is also about that and how we care for each other and take care of people. I don't have a Bella and Justice in my life, but I do have, and I never did have kids, but I do have young people in my life who are family members who are like my children and their children who are now, it's now we have two in my family, two young babies who are like they're like my grandchildren. So, and one of them, um, in one case, my cousins in Israel named their son, gave him a middle name for me, and said partly they're naming him for me because they want him to engulf the values that I believe in terms of peace, in terms of how to get good discounts and good wine, but the politics and the issues that I bring to the world. So I think that is very much what family can be about, and it doesn't have to be a traditional nuclear family either. And I would hope that this poem is also about that. It's also about the power of women. Um,
Right.
and yeah, and I do love those names. I just love them. Um,
Yeah, I thought I thought it was interesting. You kind of tied it to the first poem a little bit. These struck me in part because of this sort of theme of, this sort of feminist themes and how difficult it is and what's expected and how you're treated and they're dealing with a lot and I'm looking actually don't really have questions. I guess I just wanted to talk about it and like my thoughts. I thought it was moving and bittersweet and timeless and um it explores kind of the what if. Not that I have to make a decision anytime
no, you
soon.
don't.
I'm sure. Yeah. Many people, I guess, as they get to the point, like before menopause, it's like, well, do I want to make this huge decision that's gonna change my life? Will I regret not picking an alternate future? No, it's food for thought. And again, the men might not
Yeah,
understand such
yeah,
a heavy thing.
yeah. I will say something very personal about this poem. Since you mentioned menopause, I unexpectedly had breast cancer when I was in my late 30s.
Wow.
And at the
So,
time, and I'm fine now, but at the time, women didn't freeze eggs. That wasn't an
mm,
option. I just thought I mean, I think part of what I went through at that time, even though there are no poems about that particular thing, um, I did think I had all the time in the world in my late 30s, and that is very much reflected in these poems and in the way I've lived my life. And it turned out I didn't. I wasn't making the right choices and I was forced into a decision, and that decision I did go through early menopause and from the chemo.
yeah.
So I couldn't have kids. And I think so life is full of surprises and that you don't expect. And to bring it back to the poetry, I do think, you can either like fall down in some way, or you can figure out how to create and be creative and figure out ways to live your life that do create connections in a different way, which is also what the poetry does. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch, but poetry really does create connections in the same way that if you don't have a traditional path, which I didn't have in anything that I ever did, and still
Mm,
don't, you have to make your own connections. And I think this poem is very much about that too. The other thing I wanted to say about the poem is a friend of mine who is actually, there's a poem in this book about two older women being together who were friends since summer camp in Hudson, New York. And
yeah.
that friend is a songwriter. Her name is Hillary Rollins. And we were at summer camp together when we were 15. And we reconnected over social media when I guess about 10 years ago, and we're now very close again. And she wrote a song. She used this poem to change it to lyrics, very subtle changes, and the music was written by a composer named Michelle Borman, and they
Mm,
did a song based on this poem called also Not in This Lifetime. No, it's called, has a different title, which I now can't remember. I don't want to take the time to look up the title, but they changed it into a song, and we used
mhm,
it in the last presidential campaign. We got it
mm,
around and tried to really use it to promote it around the issue of women's empowerment and the strength of younger women to really rise up and show that they also want to say in the future in a way that maybe the older generation of women either didn't or just couldn't. So it's had this other life too, which is really nice. It's called My Daughters. That's what they call it. The
mhm.
song is called My Daughters. And it was also a very interesting thing for me to see the difference between songwriting, write song lyrics and a poem, which really are very different. And to see where Hillary changed the stanza to turn it into lyrics.
Hmm. Hmm. I'm speaking again of family, I am happy I although you don't have a Bella and Justice, I'm happy that you have kind of a chosen family and
I
close
do.
people to you, and they're going to be able to read your work.
I have Tene and Levi are the two little ones now, and they're really, yeah, wonderful little boys. Yeah. In fact, I
Sweet.
just bought for Levi a collection that when I was young, I think a lot about what turned me into a poet. And
Mm,
um, we did have a lot of books in our house. One of the series of books, we had a set of books called Journeys Through Bookland, which I was thinking about. I think it was a book that a lot of people of my generation had that their parents had bought. It's a beautiful, beautiful series with heavy scripted paper and beautiful inlays and gold gold on the pages and it's all the old like Grimm's fairy tales and Shakespeare and all these
yeah.
Longfellow and it's about 10 volumes. And I guess when my father died or when my mother died, I don't know when, somebody got rid of the books. And I was thinking about them a few months ago, and I was thinking that they definitely helped me become a writer. There's no question about it. They were the big set of books in the house that I would read. And I went
Mm,
online and I found the collection from
yay.
somebody who had it, and I bought it for my nephew, Levi. And so they're sitting here in a box to give him. He's not even two yet, so or he's
Oh.
just two. So it won't, he's got a little while, but both of my family members, the parents of both of these little kids, really want their boys to be great readers. So it's my job
Mm,
to really get it in there for them. So I'm buying them books now. And the little one in Israel, who's just he was just 4 months old when I went there. I was instructed by his mother to bring a book. So I brought the baby's first New York book, and it's
yeah. Maybe Levi will be a writer. Who's to
maybe,
say?
maybe.
But what's the baby's first New York book?
It's a picture book of
Okay,
it's called My First New York Book or something. And
very
it's just a
sweet.
picture book with like if there's a truck, it says truck, you know.
Okay, cute.
Yeah.
Yeah, not too complex
No,
yet.
no. But even a 4 month old now, he's 5 months. It's gonna take a while. Yeah.
You'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a few final kind of big questions.
Sure.
If we
Unlike all the small questions you've asked.
I think yeah, thank you. That's a good point. I guess well, let's get ready to get even bigger.
Okay.
Um, I guess what does revolution mean to you?
Oh my God.
Ooh.
Wow. Nobody's ever asked me that. I think, I guess my immediate thought is what does revolution mean to me? It means profound change. Um,
Mhm.
and it can mean, obviously, I mean, we used to, when I was younger, the phrase "the personal is political." I don't know if
Mhm.
people still say that. It was certainly a big part of my teenage years in my 20s and 30s, but I do believe that very much still. And a revolution can be positive or negative also. But I do think it means profound change. And to bring it back to poetry, I think that is of any good artwork. I think that's what, I mean, not every piece of art is revolutionary. There are artists who, I was just in Mexico City. Diego Rivera was both a political revolutionary and he created a sort of revolution in art with he and other muralists who really put that notion of mural creation on the map for artists. But not every artist creates a revolution in either the kind of work they do or what their work is, but I think we all aim for it in some small way. And um, it can be just, it can be a small revolution of moving somebody from point A or something from point A to point B, but mostly it means upsurge and turmoil and hopefully positive change. But
Right.
right now, I really don't know.
I know. We can't guarantee the positive change.
No, and often revolutions, as like the Russian Revolution,
Mm.
went in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So, uh, um, again, I think that's a role for art and artists where, I mean, people who are just driven by ideology, and if poems become ideology or ideological, which they often
Mm.
do, and they're not true to the art, something very bad happens, whether it's bad aesthetically or bad in the lives of people.
Kind of a strange question to ask after that. Um, and we did talk about this a little bit, kind of about the effect poetry has had on you. But let's think about not the ideological poetry, but do you think poetry can change the world? Or
Mm.
do you think poets are preaching to the choir?
So that's a great question because I do think that's one of the reasons I stopped writing for several decades is I felt
Yeah.
like poetry was preaching to the choir that was, increasingly graduate students and writing programs and MFAs and and I have decided poetry really can change someone's life. I'm not the first person to decide that. There are many poets, great poets before me who also were political and also wrote poems about it, like Muriel Rukeyser, who's someone I really admire and was very important to me when I was writing when I was in college, and George Oppen, another poet who was very important to me, Denise Levertov. These are all people who were important to me, Philip Levine, when I was first
Mm-hmm.
writing and are still, they're not alive anymore, but are still very important to me. But I do think more importantly, poetry can change things. And the problem is that poetry is seen as something precious and elite too often and not accessible. And one of the reasons that I write, I mean, I write like I write because it's my style. I've always written like that. But I actually appreciate the fact that my writing is fairly narrative, it's quite narrative and prosaic, because I do think it makes it accessible to people. Uh, and and I think what poetry does when it does it well is it connects dots that we didn't know were there. It brings threads, like I've said, like I'll start with a poem in one decade and it ends in a different decade, and I didn't know it was going there. And, we need to be in a world now where there is this interconnectedness and the enemies of poetry, but the enemies of democracy want to keep everything apart. And I think poetry really can not only calm people down, but can show the interconnectedness. Um, and um, and it should be not a privilege to be either read poetry or be a poet or enjoy poetry. It really should be there for everyone. I really do feel not just poetry, but all kinds of art can really make a difference.
What do you hope people take away from your work, your poetry?
Um, well, there are a few poems we haven't gotten to in this book that I
Mm.
especially hope will have an impact. As I mentioned, I spend a lot of time in Israel, and I also, as you mentioned in the introduction, I also spend time in the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank. I was just there a few weeks ago, both in Israel, visiting my family and doing some work and magazine interview, and some other things. And also, I was in Ramallah meeting with some people. I walked
Mm.
across the Kalandia checkpoint from the West Bank to Jerusalem, and was the only American in that checkpoint. I've been to Gaza 3 times. I feel like I have a unique background where I write about it politically and I'm politically active, but my poems reflect a side that is too often lost in the current debate, where I have love for both sides and both peoples, not for governments. It's not about the governments. I spend all my time fighting against the current Israeli government, but but I see the humanity in both sides, and I think my poems reflect that. And I would really hope that this book can add a piece to the conversation that has been held, especially after October 7th, where we're not canceling people out on either side and we're not boycotting artists, especially, or voices, but that all voices get to be heard. I really would hope that my poem will add to that. The other thing I hope with this book and with these poems is that it will show that phrase I've started to use since we've started to work on book publicity, a woman of a certain age, which I never thought I would use or be, has something to say and something to add. That it's not negative that this is the first book coming out, but that it's a positive, that that all of these years that I've lived and all these experiences I've had have made it into these poems, and that it can show people at all ages. Like, I'm so thrilled that you're relating to these poems in ways that I never would have expected, so that it can show people of all generations that you can choose your own path. I never had a roadmap.
Hmm.
And I just figured out day to day how I was going to live my life. And I think that that's what a good poem does. You don't write a poem with a roadmap. You start. You like, I'm going to have 4 stanzas. They're going to be end rhymes, or I'm going to write in quatrains, or I'm going to write, a sonnet. But it doesn't. If you just start writing and you let the poem take charge, it's going to end up someplace different from where you had charted it or mapped it out. Otherwise, it's not going to be a good poem. So that's what I would also hope people take from this,
Hmm.
that you can live your life and write about it and come up with all of these surprising ideas and connections and endings, and they can make it into poetry.
Um, I have one last question, and let me know if there's anything you mentioned we didn't bring up some poems. Let me know if there's anything you wanted to add or poems you want to look at. But and then I'll have you read one more.
Okay.
My last big question is if you have any advice for like aspiring poets, young poets, just beginning the writing path, especially as someone who did take a little break from
Yeah.
poetry and then boldly returned.
I would say, yeah, trust your gut more than
Hmm.
anything. Don't do what everybody else is doing.
Hmm.
Um, I don't, I haven't been in a writing workshop for many years, so I don't know if there are current trends. I'm actually about to lead a workshop for the Hudson River Writers Center in a few weeks, so I guess I'll find out by being a teacher. But I would say don't go for trends or
Hmm.
whatever is the pack. Find writers that you relate to, poets that you really like, and emulate them. Don't copy them, but emulate them. Think about, like, really look at why they're doing what they're doing and what their own narrative arc is. I think that's really, really helpful. Um, Read tons of poetry.
Hmm.
Read. The workshop I took with Joseph Brodsky in in at NYU in grad school was a craft of poetry workshop. It was not a writing workshop.
Hmm.
And it was all about Auden, the whole class. And I went back and read in his collected essays, his essay about Auden, which was essentially the class that he taught us. And I learned so much. I just went back like a month ago and reread it, and I learned so much again from that essay.
Hmm.
Reading other writers' work is the most important thing. Reading poetry, trying to figure out what it is they're doing, and figuring out where you place yourself. The other thing I would say as a sort of anecdote is the best thing that anyone ever said to me was from a writer who I greatly, greatly admired and who was also a friend of mine. And I never studied with her because she taught fiction. She was at Sarah Lawrence also. Grace
Hmm.
Paley, who's an amazing short story writer and poet. But Grace, I remember once saying to Grace, I need to find a poet. When I was in college, I remember saying to her, I need to find a poet who is a Jewish American woman who writes
Yeah.
about XYZ. And I can't find it. I mean, there were people like Muriel Kaiser or others who were doing
Hmm.
sort of things, but I needed this exact thing. And she looked at me and she said, Jo-Ann, it's you. Like, you need to, it's you. You're looking for yourself. That's what you need. That's
Hmm.
your voice. And so I would say that was the best advice I ever got. I still think
Hmm.
about that all the time. Like, trust your own instinct, and if you feel like you have a story to tell, just tell it, because that's what's going to make your writing unique.
Be who you're looking for.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Be who you're looking for.
It's pretty cool.
It is very cool. She was a pretty cool lady. She was pretty amazing. Yeah.
Huh. And thank you for that advice. And yeah, I've had such a lovely
This was
time.
wonderful. Really wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you for being so insightful. And I yeah, not everyone is. And I'd love to ask you to read your last poem.
Okay. I chose this because I felt like it was a good final bookend to this
Cool.
conversation.
Hmm.
This is a pretty new poem.
Hmm.
And it was written, again, this was the inspiration for this poem was thinking back to my first trip to Paris, which was with the guy that we've
Mr.
talked about, Mr. X,
Right.
many decades ago. I've been there many times since.
Mm,
And the what I used to write the poem, it's really a poem about aging and
mm,
in many ways about my mother and me, both of us aging. But I used the construct of a scarf to sort of wrap the whole poem around. Um,
mm,
and then that scarf turned into lots of other things. It says at least one other thing in the poem, as you'll see. Adornment. On my first trip to Paris, I bought a multicolored scarf, violet with blueberries, for my mother who left it on a bar stool at the Bluebell Inn. She was there to pick up men. I gave her the violet and blueberry scarf, and she wore it once or twice, perhaps. She went to pick up men and left it on a bar stool where she was giggling with her when she was giggling with her girlfriends. She wore it once or twice, perhaps, as she dressed in outfits distinct from her past, on a bar stool, giggling with her girlfriends. She tried to be the carefree widow. I bought her a scarf on my first trip to Paris. It's that scarf I see as she tucks her napkin in her sweater to soak up the tomato sauce across from me in the restaurant. Her once high cheekbones are sagging as she sits back in her chair. To where did the inches disappear? I see her now in me as I stare in the mirror. She wore it once or twice, perhaps, and all the other things she gave me, a Beged or suede jacket, now more than 50 years old. She was so beautiful, but when I look into the mirror, I see her sagging cheekbones and I feel inches fly from beneath my feet. Maybe the mirror lies. Memories, too. I try to contain the love as I grasp a diamond locket around my neck. From her mother to mine to me, they are dead, and I adorn myself with these bits of memory. I gave her the violet and blueberry scarf and remember it as if it were yesterday.
thank you so much
Thank
again
you.
for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yes.
had a wonderful time. And I wanted to remind folks watching or listening that this Precise Chaos is available for pre-order now on the Aerosmith website, aerosmithpress.com. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. This was really terrific. Bye, Laura.
Bye.